I grew up in Seattle, Washington. Was exposed to the sport of wrestling in a roundabout way. My best friend's older brothers both wrestled in the junior high school, and they drug Bobby and I to a wrestling tournament and kind of threw us in the novice division because they thought it was funny, us having never wrestled a day in our lives. But I got my first bloody nose and pinned a kid with a headlock, because I think every little kid knows what a headlock is, and that was my exposure to wrestling. I showed up in junior high school the next year, and the coach remembered me and said, "Hey, wrestling starts Monday. I'll see you there." And I've been wrestling ever since. I'd heard stories my whole life about my father and what a good wrestler he was and what a tough guy he was. And so I kind of thought if I started wrestling, maybe I'd get his attention. He'd come around a little more. That didn't really work. He never saw me wrestle one match, but my mom was at every single match. I wrestled for the United States Army. I was a regular soldier in the Army. At that time, in the peak of the Cold War, I was stationed in, my first duty station was Hanau, West Germany.
I found Randy in Germany. He was wrestling in a community tournament. I believe he got second in freestyle and won the Greco-Roman. And I picked him to come back to the Army training camp at West Point. He wasn't the best wrestler on the team when he came, but he was the type of individual that had the ability, and I saw that.
Ultimately, I ended up making the team and winning a couple of inter-service championships, which qualified me for the Olympic trials. And in 1988, I was an alternate on the Olympic team in Greco-Roman wrestling as a soldier. I ended up getting a call, ultimately, a collect call, by the way, from Tommy Chesbro. They were interested in me coming to Oklahoma State.
He was so good at tie-ups and controlling mat positions and a fierce competitor, so it was really fun to get him into a room at Oklahoma State where we had a lot of really slick wrestlers, but we needed somebody that a little more mature, which his time in the Army made him, and he did such a great job mentoring the athletes in the room, and so fun to work with.
But I don't think I actually learned how to win until I wrestled at Oklahoma State. Obviously, we were two-time national champions and runners-up twice, and I was a runner-up in the finals my junior and senior year at 190 pounds. We hadn't had very many successful Greco-Roman wrestlers that came from the U.S., so that was, again, another challenge. You know, throw down the gauntlet, a guy that's wearing a uniform and wants to be the best at something. That was all the challenge I needed. I tried to focus and predominantly be a world champion for the U.S. in Greco-Roman wrestling. The sport of mixed martial arts was a little bit different when I started. I think everybody was out to show that their style of fighting was the best style. I entered that first mixed martial arts competition to show what wrestlers were all about and what they were capable of. I realized very quickly that I had a lot to learn, that wrestling was a great place to start, but I had a whole bunch of other stuff that I needed to figure out. So I kind of got on the journey of trying to learn these other things and make myself as complete a fighter as I could be. But I think I applied that wrestler's mindset to everything that I tried to learn, and I think that's what allowed me a ton of success. The athleticism and particular intensity that wrestling breeds is what makes successful mixed martial artists.
He'd go to Japan or Seattle, or I would go out to Florida or California, and we would come back with new things, and we would experiment. We would figure out how things worked, why they worked, and we would create our own art out of this sport. As a six-time world champion in the UFC, I mean, that's pretty incredible accomplishment alone. But he was a very innovative, creative athlete.
I've been fighting for a couple of years. My first fight in Las Vegas occurred, and I walked past a store called Juicy Couture with my last name on the sign. And I think that's when the light bulb went off for me, and that's when the idea of a line of clothes using my last name, and then ultimately a need for gyms, seeing the opportunity to use my name as a public figure and a competitive athlete to grow some other companies that didn't require me to get punched in the face, frankly. That's kind of how I ended up on that road. And obviously the training center and the clothing companies are still running to this day and doing pretty well. Acting was not something I ever saw myself doing. It's something that athletics created or opened the door for. They were looking for authentic cage fighters for a scene in a movie called Cradle to the Grave with Jet Li and DMX. And that was my first real opportunity to be on a set. The whole thing, I think, was a week long for shooting that one 3 or 4 minute scene in that movie. And 12, 14-hour days. It was a grind, but I mean, we're used to grinding in wrestling. So it was immediately intriguing to me. I went out and started taking some acting classes and got a real agent. And from Cradle to the Grave, the job started slowly getting better and better. And ultimately, here I am 16 years later, still pursuing acting jobs and having a great time acting. In the mid-2000s, after the war on terror started and after 9/11, I got the chance with Rich Franklin, another fighter, to go to Iraq and spend 12 days on the ground with our guys wearing the uniform and putting their butts on the line, frankly, for our country and our way of life. And came back the next year. Got to go to Washington, D.C. and spend a little time in the hospital with some of those guys that had been injured, that were fresh off that battlefield. And that was a very moving experience for me. And I knew at that time, hearing some of their stories and some of the things they were struggling with as they were in transition, that there was something we could do. And I founded the Extreme Couture GI Foundation. Every year we get to go out to Washington, D.C. and sit down with a soldier and their families that are in that transition and write them a check. 100% of the proceeds from my foundation through the Georgia chapter and the Las Vegas chapter of the Extreme Couture GI Foundation go to help wounded soldiers as they're in transition to becoming civilians again. And it's something I'm very passionate about. The biggest thing that wrestling has taught me that's allowed me to transition into fighting, that's allowed me to carry on into acting, that's pushed me through the business practices that I have is a confidence. I don't think there's any place you're more vulnerable and more exposed than you are in the center of that mat. And whether you won or lost, being able to walk out there and do what you trained to do gives you a particular confidence. I think it's one of those things that you get out of it exactly what you put into it. And I think that's the biggest lesson that I've learned from wrestling that's carried over into the rest of my life. Well, I don't think I can express the honor of being inducted into the Hall of Fame. I spent most of my life on a wrestling mat, and it would have been nice to have achieved something in the sport and been up on that wall in the Hall of Fame as an athlete, but to be recognized as an outstanding American, I don't know if it gets any better than that.